So it's not just that the gaze itself is objectifying, that it establishes this unequal power dynamic between the patient and the doctor. It's that the doctor is not objective. It's that the doctor is not actually uncovering some like ultimate truth of disease that the body is revealing through physical symptoms. Rather, they are, for Foucault, more a kind of expert user of medical language, and they can read this onto the objectified body to decide how to interpret, understand, and ultimately treat it. The entire medical gaze, then, is filtered through and indeed created by medical language. So for Foucault, the main thing here is that medical language is a language of power because it carries with it an assumption of objectivity and rationality. This inherently places the user above the receiver because we assume that medicine itself is objective and rational. But is that assumption justified? So once upon a time when I was less jaded by the crushing need to be able to pay for things, nice time to mention the Patreon here, actually. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe at patreon.com/militantempathy. But yes, in my younger years, I was actually studying to become a professional historian, and I had a particular interest in medical history. So this section of the show should hopefully be very much within my wheelhouse because we're going to talk about the history of psychiatry. Now, psychiatry as like a formal medical specialty is actually quite new. It emerges really in the mid-19th century, so the 1800s, with what historians in the past have called the first psychiatric revolution. And no, that didn't mean that there were a bunch of therapists out in the street rioting, pitchforks in hand, demanding greater self-awareness from the masses, funny as that would be. The revolution referred more to a shift in methods and approaches used to treat the insane. Because in as much as psychiatry is new and emerging in the mid-19th century, regimes for treating the insane were well established long before this. And in this section, we're going to discuss some of these regimes. So expect to hear about medical so-called treatments and theories that some listeners may find distressing because of their frankly horrifying nature. Now, to return to my main man, Foucault, he has written pretty extensively about this history in two of his books, Madness and Civilization and The Birth of the Clinic. And in both books, he does this very typically Foucault-type argument, where he takes the general assumption that society has gradually gotten better, more humane, and more progressive over the course of history, that's inherent to a lot of Western thought, and he picks it apart, essentially arguing, well, look, we might think that X thing here being modern psychiatry, is better than what came before, just letting mad people roam around free and largely untreated. But actually, here's why X thing is in fact much more repressive and inhumane. And this is essentially the same basic structure of argument that he makes in all his books, or at least the ones that I've read. So he does this with like the modern prison system and Discipline and Punish, arguing that it actually created a carceral state that was far more repressive because it's based on near total surveillance than the old regimes of just like chopping people's hands off in the village square for crime. He's also done it with sexual norms and history of sexuality, where he argued that modern sexual politics may appear more liberated than historical ones, but they actually aren't because of XYZ. Basically, Foucault's take is always to disrupt the notion of linear progress through historical time and argue that everything that seems less like a prison nowadays is actually much more like a prison than historical prisons, which is why we have the like Foucault butterfly prison meme, which you can also see in the Instagram carousel that I've posted to accompany this episode. Now, I and a lot of other historians don't wholeheartedly buy into Foucault's take because he seems to have a tendency to romanticize the past, and because things like getting your hands chopped off or being left to wander the earth for the rest of your life in an untreated schizophrenic rage actually seem pretty objectively bad, even if the systems that we have today are also quite bad. But the reason why he remains so influential in the history of medicine is because he's like the first main guy to really question these myths that medicine had been telling about itself, basically since the Enlightenment era, which was essentially a lot of white men patting themselves on the back for their ever-improving rationality and civility, and for moving away from the more barbarous medical procedures of the Middle Ages. And that was definitely very necessary because otherwise we would just be uncritically buying into the propaganda that the psychiatric profession had been telling about itself since inception. So what exactly was happening in this period? Well, the main change was theoretical. Essentially, people come to increasingly believe that you can authoritatively identify, diagnose, and treat various kinds of insanity. that insanity can be cured. And this belief spurns a flurry of theories on how best to do that. Now, it's not that, people before this time never thought that insanity could be cured.